Hi everyone, welcome to this week's lecture video. And today we will be talking about chapters 5 and 6 of Arguing About Literature. Right. Um, Before that, I want to talk about the title of your essays, right? And the title, try to be creative with your titles, right? The name of the author and the chosen story that you're writing about should be incorporated not in the title but in the introduction, right? So that should be part of your sentence, part of part of one of your sentences in the introduction, right? So not in the title. Um, so try to be creative when you write a title for your essay, right? And here's one example on page 126, right? This is Dylan Reef's essay about Rachel Kaddish's short story, right? And so the title of the story that that Dylan is writing about is "Letters Arrive from the Dead," right? And then the title of his essay is "Letters Don't Arrive from the Dead," right? So what he's doing here is he's taking the title of um, of the story that he will be writing about, right, and just playing on that title, right? So that's one way that you can write your own title, but you don't have to follow that kind of formula, right? You can if you want to, but yeah, just try to be creative. You know, it's not that big of a deal, but you want your title um, to say something about your argument and to say something about your story, right? Yeah, so that's just one thing about the title. Okay, so let's jump right into chapter 5, right? Chapters 5 and 6, there's not really much for me to talk about, so this will be a shorter lecture video. But here, they're just breaking down for you, right? The writing process, writing essay writing process, right? How you come about to how you come, I guess, like how you sort of figure out what to write about, what themes to write about, right? And then how you sort of like structure your arguments, right? So I suggest really, reading these chapters because you will get like a step-by-step sort of instruction on how to structure your paper, right? So as you notice here, right, we have on page 104, we have a short story by Rachel Kaddish called "Letters Arrive from the Dead," right? Um, and then on page 107, we get sort of a breakdown of Dylan Reef's sample essay, right, on Kaddish's short story, right? So if you notice on page 107, here we get an example of an excerpt from Dylan's free writing, right? So this story doesn't really have a plot. Instead, it comes across to me as a kind of report. The narrator is explaining what the afterlife is like, focusing on the letters that the dead write to the living, right? So if you notice this sort of free writing, right, that they've included here, it's pretty similar to your responses, right? And that is the reason why I ask you. Well, first, I ask you to do the response or reading response because that's a proof for me that you've done the reading, right? So that's one thing. And so the second reason for the writing exercises, your writing responses, right, is for you to sort of free write, right, your sort of initial impression to the stories, right? And that kind of initial impression, right? That will guide you into coming up with ideas and themes to write about for your paper, right? So what you were essentially doing in the response papers is just kind of like free writing, right? Free writing your ideas and first impressions about the story that you might choose to write about, right? Right, and then the rest of the chapter really is just sort of breaking down for you, um, right, like how to organize your essay, right? And if you notice on page 111 to 112, right, you get kind of a sample here of an outline, right, that you can follow um, in writing your essay, right? And this outline is pretty similar to what I've provided for you in the prompt, right? So feel free to imitate this. Feel free to imitate the outline that I've also provided for you. All right, and then on page 112 to 113, right, we get another discussion on style, right? And in terms of style, what this section is talking about usually is the point of view, right? Should you write from the I perspective, right? And as you know, I've mentioned this in the past, but for this particular for our particular assignments, right? I want you to use the first person, right? Um, and the first person perspective, because this is really not kind of like a research paper, right? This is more like an analysis paper, and so part of that analysis is your own sort of personal impression and sort of personal analysis to the stories, right? And you can develop this, if you want to sort of like expand this into a research paper where you will be looking at other sources and incorporating other sources and other people's reading of the story, yeah, you can do that. But for the sake of this paper, it is just your own sort of like personal analysis, right? Your personal close reading. Obviously you will use sort of um, kind of like literary references and symbolism and the themes and issues that we've talked about, right? You will be using that, but for the most part, this is your own sort of like interpretation, right? You're arguing for your own personal interpretation of the story, right? So it's important to use the first person I perspective, because that will sort of I guess it it will it will give the reader a sense that you are not only analyzing sort of from a distance, right? But you're actually analyzing um, as I guess like you're analyzing as a thinking and a feeling um, sort of reader, right? That you're sort of reading it and interpreting it, and sort of interpreting how the stories sort of make you feel, right? What kind of sort of like emotions do the reading um, sort of got out of you, right? And especially because the stories that we're reading, right, short stories, um, they're sort of they're very emotional short stories, right? They're either about family dynamics, right, marriage, romance, right, or brotherhood, or whatever, right? But these short stories are very emotional, and so that sort of emotion that is captured in the descriptions, that's captured in the dialogues, right? That's something that you can't just sort of talk about at a distance, right? That's something that you understand as emotional because you yourself sort of feel that emotion, right? I hope that that's making sense. But yeah, but for for this particular essays that we're writing for this class, I really want to sort of more than um, your ability to analyze and to close read, right? Um, I want to sort of like see that you sort of you understand, but then you also kind of that you're identifying, right, the emotions that are being expressed, not only because the story is emotional, right, um, but because the descriptions and the dialogues, the way the story unfolds, right, through the style of the story, sort of it makes it emotional for you personally, right? Yeah. So, so I think I mean that's the reason why um, I think the first person is important for a paper, right? And and it's not that's not to say that everything will be just like opinion. I feel this way. I feel that way. You have to sort of like uh, identify patterns, right? Identify symbolisms and stuff like that, right? But here and there, you just want to add things, right? Like there's an example here on, or examples on page 113, right? Just using phrases, right? Like, as I suggested earlier, as I have noted, right? As I argue later, right? These sort of kind of like referring to your own voice, right? That's what I'm looking for. So for chapter 6, um, here we just get sort of an introduction to different genres, literary genres, right? Specifically um, of the short story, of the novel, of the novella, right, and poetry, right? And for the sake of our class, right, we will be focusing on short stories or short fiction, right? And I kind of like the quote here on page 138, right? Um, it says, "Short fiction is the art of the glimpse," right? It deals in echoes and reverberations. Craftily, it withholds information, right? While novels tell all, right? And so, as I mentioned before, I picked short stories for this class because it's a short class, and I feel like short stories um, are easier to read, right, in obviously a shorter period of time as opposed to reading long novels. So that's kind of like the practical side of why I chose short stories, right? Um, but another thing about short stories, right, is that here, what it's saying is that short stories are narratives that are designed to sort of like withhold information, right? That you're only given sort of parts of a whole, and you're meant to sort of fill the gaps, right? And that's and I see that in your reading responses, right? Some of you say how sometimes difficult to understand what the lessons are of the stories, or it's hard to sort of like keep track. There's so much going on, um, and it's unclear what the contexts are, right, and stuff like that. And you're right to think that, right, because yeah, that's kind of, obviously the short story is short, so you can only fit so much into the story. You can only put so much information, right? But I think that's very crucial because it's short, right? You really have to, you know, I mean, the author, right? The author of the short story really has to design it in a way that um, it's still sort of like understandable, right? You still understand what's going on, this and that, right? Um, but as the author, you also have to know that what you're leaving out, what you're not saying, um, is just as important, right? And that you want readers to imagine, right? Or to you want your readers to know how to imagine what's being left out, right? And so what's being left out, what the gaps are, right, in the short stories, that's your job, right, as the critic. You, in this sense, you are a literary critic, right, where you are giving us interpretation and analysis of the story, right, because there's not enough information given in the story, right, that it's your job now to sort of fill in those gaps and give us a sound interpretation and analysis, right, of what you think the author is doing. Why did the author choose to talk about this and not that, right? So that will be your sort of job, right? Um, in a more practical level, right? Just to kind of like give you a kind of idea of what the difference is, right? How I usually sort of think about the difference between the short story, the novella, and the novel, right? Is just the length, right? The length is that's the only difference, right? Short stories, I consider anything that's about 80 pages or less, I consider that a short story, right? Something around 80 pages to 110 pages, right? That would be sort of called a novella, right? So it's kind of in between the short story and the novel, right? And anything more than 110 pages, I usually sort of just consider that a novel, right? And there's probably different interpretations, but that's kind of the typical way of making the distinction, right? Um, and so yeah, and so short stories are supposed to be just giving glimpses, right, and withholding information, right? So that's kind of like one interpretation of what a short story is supposed to be. But other people have also claimed that short stories they're not necessarily withholding, right? But they are actually a more perfect. That's perfect in quotation, right? Some people have claimed that short stories are, a more perfect version of a novel, in that you know, it's a novel that has been sort of stripped down of all the inessentials, right, and all the pretenses, and then what you're left is just the core of the novel, right? And so those people who claim that, right, they're saying that it's not like a matter of withholding information, right, but it's short stories are giving you all that you need, right? That it's actually just, you know, that it should be sort of seen as, as it is, right? That's the whole, right? And it's not like it's just like part of a whole, or that that it's just like that short stories are supposed to be the beginning or the seed of a novel, right? That's true too in many cases. A lot of short stories have been developed by the author into a longer novel, right? But some people say that the short story is actually sort of a more perfect version of the novel, in that it's stripped away of all the inessentials, and it's giving you all you need, right, to know about a story, right? And so those are kind of um, conflicting, but I think they're both true, right? I think some short stories um, are just perfect the way that they are, and they should not be sort of made into longer novels. But I think some short stories also deserve to be turned into longer novels, right? So it just sort of depends, I think, on the author, right? And some authors write short stories to sort of get their creative juices flowing, right? Uh, into turning that into a novel, right? Um, and some writers just kind of they just write short stories, and they're good at it, right? And they just kind of perfect short stories, right? Flannery O'Connor, for example, right? She has two novels, I think, and a lot of critics have said that her novels are less, or that her short stories are sort of more superior than her novels, right? And that somehow Flannery O'Connor is just really good at writing short stories, right? That when she tried to write novels, it didn't sort of, they're still good. I think they're still really good, but that sort of like shock value, right? That we get from her short stories, it doesn't sort of um, it doesn't have the same effect, right? When sort of when put into a novel, right? So yeah, it's just kind of like it's just a different sort of process, I guess, right? So on page 154, we have another example, right, um, of an essay about a short story, right? And I won't talk too much about it, but I just want to talk about the introduction, right? And here in the introduction, the author is using the issue of definition, right? And so she's writing about Eudora Welty's short story, A Visit of Charity, right? And so in the title, it says the real meaning of charity, right? And so you get a sense that this paper is going to use the issue of definition, right? So she's taking the word charity and uh, giving us, different variations of how the word is being used, right, in the short story. And so let's just read a couple of sentences in the introduction. So many people would define the word charity as an act of uh, as an act in which an individual or institution sincerely offers materials or spiritual comfort to someone less fortunate. In this respect, charity is a form of love. Such is the meaning implied in the King James translation of the most famous statement about charity. 1 Corinthians 13:13, quote, "And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity." In fact, some other translations of this biblical passage use love instead of charity, thereby suggesting that the two terms are more or less equivalent. But Marion, the protagonist of Eudora Welty's short story A Visit of Charity, does not appear to demonstrate this concept of charity when she visits the old lady's home, right? And so yeah, so immediately you get you know that this writer is interested in the issues of definition, right, or the issue of definition, right, where she's taking the word charity and giving us sort of like what we sort of like commonly know as as or what we know what definition, I guess, um, of the word charity that we all sort of like that we all know, right? And but then she's giving us a different usage of the word, or she's arguing that the short story is actually using a different use of the word charity, right? And notice too how she defines the word charity using biblical terms, right? And that's a very smart decision to do, because the word charity is very much, traditionally, the word charity is very much linked traditionally, but also even today, right? The word charity is very much sort of connected to sort of like religious acts, right? Especially in the Christian sort of tradition, right? And so, quoting here, right, from the Bible, right, to define the word charity, and then saying that, so here's what the Bible says about the word charity, but then here's what I think Theodore Welty is doing by using the word charity, right? And so I think that's a very effective way of doing that, because yeah, the word charity is very much embedded in sort of in the Bible and in the sort of Christian tradition, right? So yeah, so that's a good example of how you might use the issue of definition in your essay, right? So I think that's it for this lecture video. I know this is very short because I think I've sort of talked about most of the things that are being mentioned in these chapters, right? But I think it's really important for you to really sort of go through these chapters, but focus on, especially if you're having a hard time, right? Organizing your ideas, organizing your arguments, right? The sample essays here are really helpful, right? In sort of helping you organize your paper, right? And feel free to sort of imitate and follow the structure, right, of these sample essays, and how they write the introduction, how they write the conclusion, how they organize the body paragraphs, right? Okay, so that's it for this video, and I will see you in the next video.